Today on TFR, we're talking to Rishi Moudgil, the founding executive director of Greenlight Fund Detroit, a national nonprofit that aims to harness the vision and ambition of social entrepreneurs and accelerate the spread of proven programs that make a lasting change for children, youth, and families. Greenlight's model gets to the heart of the problem.
So we're talking to Rishi about building cross-sector partnerships and civic engagement for social entrepreneurship in this very profit-driven ecosystem. And we're also diving into the experiences that shaped him into the leader he is today, including the first project that really introduced him to the idea of social entrepreneurship. And that was called K-Grams, as well as building scalable systems and implementing impact frameworks for layered and complex social issues.
Founder, managing director, social entrepreneur, storyteller, filmmaker, and now executive director. Rishi, when I read that, so I knew you before this, but when I read that, I was like, goodness, that's a lot. So when do you sleep? because because I know that you work on several different projects, as well as fulfilling, your own personal things that fulfill your purpose. So did this start when you were a teenager, where you kind of had an inkling of what you wanted to do, or?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. It's great to join your podcast and be with you guys. Yeah, it's funny as you're listing those things. You don't necessarily do all those things at once, but sometimes you do try to do a lot of them. I think, yeah, just being a creator, I would say, right, a builder. That's something that's always been a key part of my identity. And it's funny you said that about teenage years, because it just came up with our family. We were talking about some things, and it was like, yeah, when I was in school, it was similar, right? I was always trying to find new things to start, or create a new club at school, or try to volunteer and build a new idea. And so I've always found value for myself and the communities that I've been in to try to build and create things. And so, yeah, that's definitely where I get my energy and interest. And sometimes I'm directly doing it, and other times I'm helping other people while they're doing their dreams and visions. And both are very fulfilling to me.
I relate to that, and being creative and finding fulfillment in building new things. And you definitely have tons of experience in that. I mean, I look at the program we were talking about the other day, K-Grams that you built, and then from there going on and start as statewide initiatives that then turn into global initiatives. So can you talk about how you built those programs, and how it transformed into from a state initiative to a global initiative?
Sure. Yeah. Happy to talk about some of those things early in my career, and really even while I was at school. I think when you're an entrepreneur, you have an entrepreneurial mindset, right? You're always trying to find where new value can, be built or created. And I was like that, I think, as well. And so, you mentioned K-Grams. That was an idea I had in school while I was at the University of Michigan. And similarly, the way that entrepreneurs and folks, build new opportunities in the communities that they're in. When I was on this campus at that time, one of the things I saw was, well, there seems to be two types of ways that at that time people could volunteer. There was these one-off, come to an event and volunteer for a few hours and go home, or there were these really intensive, for the people that were fully in it, you get some training, you're doing like some serious like social work type, commitments. And there wasn't that much in between, right? There weren't these opportunities for people who wanted to get more engaged, but weren't, committed to it as their primary objective. Anyway, so that's an example of, as I'm thinking back then, why I created a program at that time called K-Grams, Kids Programs. And the idea was, how can we get young adults who want to volunteer to more regularly be able to commit and engage with the community? And so we built this program where we paired up residence halls on our college campus with elementary schools in Detroit, in Ypsi, and in parts of Ann Arbor. And so that was kind of the starting thing. Is like, how can we get a lot of people more directly involved and volunteer and spend their time? And that was right. My friends, the people that I was, but just like any other good entrepreneurial idea, you try to solve, like, what are people trying to do? And of course, I've always been drawn to education and those causes. So anyhow, we launched that program really just out of university. And then we found that it was something that people really wanted to do. And that, most importantly, we were working in schools and partnering with teachers directly. And that grew, my passion interest really, really early on, hearing directly from people that are working on things and wanting different solutions than they could have otherwise from the existing structures they were in. So, without, I actually haven't told you too many details of what the program is, but from like the high level, how did we get there? Why were we thinking about those things? That's, I think that, a lot of the point of this podcast was, just identifying problems and listening to people. I think that's one thing with like entrepreneurship that I've realized. A lot of people, especially consumers, think about products and services. Once they get it, they're like, wait, this product and service is awesome. But usually if you have a good idea and you've built something really well, what you're actually just doing is listening to people. Mm-hmm. So my first really big project, which was K-Grams, and then became a program, and then became a nonprofit. And then, after I graduated, we expanded it to multiple cities. So it just kind of kept going in a lot of ways. It was because we just kept listening to people. What do the teachers want? How are our kids able to do the things they want to do in the program? How are the volunteers being engaged? What do they like? What do they don't like? And then also that was kind of related to this, back then, sort of newer idea of social entrepreneurship, which is, fusing these ideas around, building new entities and pulling skills and attributes from different sectors, right? How do you have a good sound financial management plan? How do you have a revenue base? But also, how do you pay attention to the community? So we were thinking of all these things early on, and these things are universal, and so kind of, to your question too, whether it was just a small, group of us on campus, whether it was a city, whether it was a state program, whether it grew, beyond our borders, what we just kept doing was asking and just listening to people. Is this something you need? Right? Iterate on the idea of kind of, listening to people and trying to make that better. And then, building systems so that you could build it, more and more and beyond. So those were all kind of the elements, at least with that program. And to be clear, like we did grow a little too fast, and we did make a ton of mistakes, and we had to then, scale the whole thing back because we didn't think too much about, well, we thought about, but we didn't have the right tools, a lot of the right foundational elements.
Yeah.
When I was 20 years old, I thought, this is what I'll be doing for the rest of my life. This is my idea, my passion, and spent so much time on it, but I also saw how valuable it was. And so we had a lot of trouble, like getting that back to a size and a scope that was workable and healthy for the volunteers and the people giving all their time to make it work. And that taught me a lot, right? That taught me a lot about, and I use that in my job still today, about how you, responsibly build, how you responsibly grow, not just to do it because, you feel like it's the hot thing or everyone wants to do it.
Oh, 100%. I mean, I really think that like building cross-sector relationships or partnerships is really essential to collective impact. It's definitely essential. I think you've really done a phenomenal job of that. I think, what you've done is a really great example for us to learn about. And then especially as we build those partnerships, to also be responsible in the process.
Right, that's right. Well, when you think about, regardless of if you're, it doesn't matter what you're creating as a creator or as a founder. Essentially, what you're doing is you're building value, in the world that didn't exist necessarily prior, or wasn't identified in that way. And so, there's a lot of semantics around social or, inclusive or, for-profit, nonprofit business. We have a lot of systems and structures, and I have some thoughts on all those too. But at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is figure out, is this something, that benefits people or the planet in some way? And then you got to figure out the details, how you want to do it, what the levers are, how deeply you want to go. And that requires, as you were saying, sort of this cross-sector thinking, right? The best ideas, the best progress, in my opinion, are those who have listened and learned from different arenas. Sometimes you don't use all those things, but you learn something from it. And sometimes you do use some of the tools from different arenas. And I think that's also the most interesting space, to build and be a founder and try to create value.
I actually wanted to ask you more about social entrepreneurship, so that was like the perfect segue into that. And I guess I'm wondering, first of all, what would you say is your own definition of social entrepreneurship, and what do you think are some of the biggest misconceptions around that whole space?
There's a lot of phrases and words that use the word social, right? Social entrepreneurship, social innovation, right? Social investing. So, social is a precursor to a lot of things. And so one thing we've done is try to really define what we just mean by social, and broadly social impact first. Because if we have a grounding of what we're talking about on social impact, then we can talk about, okay, all these things that have the word social, they mean they're trying to accomplish some sort of social impact. And I also know that word is, people have different reactions to it too, but, we have to start somewhere. And so with social impact specifically, right, I define that as a significant positive change that addresses a pressing social challenge. So that's something that is universal, right? If you are a social entrepreneur, that means you're an entrepreneur working on significant positive changes that address pressing social challenges, right? If you're a social innovator, you're innovating around positive changes, social challenges. So that kind of gives me a frame when I think about, social entrepreneurs and social entrepreneurship, is that you're creating, an entity, an initiative, a business. And by putting that social, tag on it, what you're saying is, I'm creating this, for this greater good as a primary reason that I'm doing the work. And, that also then unlocks a whole bunch of other sets of questions, right? Because who defines what's good and what's not good, right? Who's going to define what those pressing social challenges are? Generally, entrepreneurs, when we're starting things, we're solving problems that affect us personally, right? And so when you're really because that's what you know the most about, as you shouldn't be trying to solve problem for other people. They need to be, anyone you're trying to create a product or service or solve an issue for, they need to be front and center. So for social entrepreneurs to think about what are those significant changes and those positive changes they want, it's baked in this idea that you're tackling a challenge that whoever your end users are, whoever your consumers are, whoever you're trying to kind of utilize your initiative or product or service, that they're the ones who are saying, this is what I'm struggling with, and I want to be a part of something that helps to solve this. And you are a partner in that process. You're not necessarily the person coming in with all the solutions and solving things for other people. So that's just a little bit of a riff on that.
It also kind of relates to, I guess, like a lot of the work that you did as managing director at the Center for Social Impact at and I find that that's probably was an interesting role, because it was sort of also like very intersectional, and you were kind of looking at different schools and the problems that the students in those schools are looking at solving. So I guess what were some of the areas of focus for you in that role? And then how did that sort of help you transition into your next role?
Returning to university was great, and running, kind of programs and thinking through this idea of broadly social impact and different sectors, different disciplines, different interests around building entities that were also tackling, social good. In fact, like, this isn't a new concept. To be clear, like, we've been doing this, forever, for hundreds of years. It's taken different names, and depending on kind of the year or the society that we're in, right, we kind of couch it in different ways. So that's one thing that when you get into the academics of it all, you realize that a lot of this isn't that different. It's just the systems and the tools and the times are a little bit different. So, being in that position, campuses are really a great place to really to truly get at those different disciplines. So when I was in that role as a founding director of a center that was focused on this social impact and intersectionality of disciplines, we could very deliberately have social work, public policy, business, education, urban planning at a table, and collectively start thinking about, not only, we didn't start with what are some solutions, what are things that people want to launch. You start with the question on what are the challenges in your disciplines, in your worlds that you're trying to overcome. And then let's listen and learn from each other on how, we can then build from there and maybe get a path towards solutions. So, that was a critical part to that, that experience, is bringing students and faculty who are, by definition, experts in very particular things. And, in a lot of ways, again, bringing those folks together who don't normally go and kind of play with folks across the street. You bring those together in the same spaces and you realize, wait a second, we can create a lot of, value together. We can do things like it, it might not matter if you call it social entrepreneurship or just this is something else that we're doing. The idea, there is yeah, exactly, pulling in actors who don't normally play together, finding out and learning from each other, and then building value together. So that was really enriching. We did create some of these definitions, some of these frameworks, because as you know well, there's so many people right now looking for, these avenues and paths of, quote, doing good. And there's this tug and pull between purpose and work, and, the purpose of work and impact, it's everywhere. And so we had a little microcosm of that on campus. And now I think society as a whole is really is grappling with this. Individuals are grappling with this. And on those measures, language matters, right? As we said, if none of us can agree what we're talking about, even the idea of purpose is another word, like impact and social impact. That can mean 100 things, right? We have to get really clear about what we're going after. Now, we can't demonize certain people whose value might be, I need economic security. Therefore, I'm going to have, that might be their top value as an entrepreneur, let's say, for example. So if they don't identify as a social entrepreneur, for example, is that good or bad? Who makes that decision? A lot of entrepreneurs and founders, frankly, right, we have a lot of privilege to be able to pursue new ideas, right? To be able to take the time and energy and mental space and have the health and the networks to go out on our own. So all of these factors come into play. We dived into a lot of those things in that position, in this academic setting. But one of the big takeaways was we need some more common frameworks. Like, that should be the responsibility of the experts, the leaders in academia and other places like that, so that people, in society can engage more directly and deliberately with each other.
Yeah, I think that's huge. And you know what, when you were talking about the different value that cross-sector relationships can bring, it made me think of the for-profit arena. and how many times, one, they may not understand social entrepreneurship. But to your point, this has been something that's been happening for, years. We've been doing this for a very long time, but due to it being a lack of a common framework, it's hard to digest to someone who's in a for-profit landscape. So I wanted to ask you what type of value and or support you feel that those individuals within that for-profit landscape can bring to this common framework that we would hope that could be created one day to support social entrepreneurs.
Yeah, appreciate that thought. And I might reframe it a little bit. Not only those who are in profit seeking positions or for-profit companies, but really another frame to think about is like those in power, right?
Yeah.
Within organizations, because you can have nonprofit organizations that have so much influence or dollars or revenue as well. But so when I think about that, and it's usually the owners. For nonprofits, that's the board or the founders. Sometimes the donors have a certain influence. For companies, again, it's the owners, the founders, or maybe the shareholders. So one thing I really like to think about more directly, and similarly, we've been building these frameworks and thoughts on who are all right. Excuse me. And broadly, I know around business we've talked about who are all the stakeholders involved in business. So let me kind of reset to say, let's start there. So when you look at owners, employees, customers, but you also look at the supply chain, you look at the community, you look at the planet. These are all very specific and different sets of stakeholders it could be a business, but it also could be in other entities. In a nonprofit, for example, you have a lot of those same entities, and you also have donors. You also have volunteers. The complexity, it's actually harder in the nonprofit and the public sector to do this sort of work, because what you're actually doing is you're looking at each set of stakeholders and you're asking yourself, what is the value this entity creates for those stakeholders, and how much value can they derive from this work? So if I'm a for-profit company and I'm an owner, let's say, for example, and I own all the profits in the company, which is fairly common, right? If you make beyond X, all the benefit accrues to the owner, and the owner might be a number of shareholders. So, right, you have set a value judgment for each set of stakeholders in that entity around profits, right? And I'm not saying it's good or bad. It's just what it is. In that entity, if you make more money than what you've spent, the stakeholders that will benefit will be the owners. And so, that's like an example to start from, right? Now you have a lot of people questioning that. Well, should the employees have a stake in that, right? Should the community have a stake in those profits? Were those profits made off of really squeezing the supply chain? And so people are worse off because of it? These are all complex questions, but once we just start thinking about people, right? That's, I think, probably the theme that's coming out here, right? And stakeholders, how are they affected? What is their value? Not just not just positive, but also maybe some of the drawbacks. And I think founders know this better than anyone, because founders, they play every role when they're starting, right? They're like, oh, I'm the customer, I'm trying it out. I got to pay I got my friends and family, they're my supply chain. I'm the one doing all the work. I live in the community I'm in, and then as things grow, you start segmenting, right? You start having other people affected by your work and contributing to your work. So regardless if you're in the sort of social space or in the for-profit space, I think this is the exercise you have to do. And this is where you can really learn from other sectors too, right? If I'm a nonprofit executive and I'm very deliberately thinking about all those different stakeholders, what value do we provide to them, and what are they, how much of it are they getting? you might have to be considering a lot different sets or more sets of stakeholders than a for-profit. And it also might not be the case. There's some for-profits that are very involved and very conscious about all of those categories, while you have some nonprofits that might have other goals altogether. So anyway, I don't want to talk in too many circles around that point, but those are just some of the examples when I think about, it's, we have this we kind of have this bias in our thinking that, well, if you're in a for-profit company, you must be really good at X, Y, and Z, right? And oh, you're a nonprofit person, or you're in education or social work, you must really be good at this stuff. It's almost like the heart stuff is on this side and the dollar stuff is on this side, right? That's one of the frameworks we talk about, is like, no. Like, this is just a spectrum. We all need some heart. We all need some dollars. It's just, you can chop that up in many ways. And everyone is looking at that right now. Everyone's trying to ask those questions for themselves, whether they're an employee or, a customer or a consumer or a user of those products and services. In fact, those are the people that are demanding it the most, which is what makes markets change in the for-profit space. So, so I'll pause there. But
Yeah, I don't understand why it always gets split into these categories, but hopefully that's changing, and I think it is, and because we're having a conversation about it right now, so I think that also goes a long way in making people think differently in terms of how we can scale our impact in the best way possible. So, and I think you obviously had experience working in the social impact space when you did K-grams, and then when you were a director and you were sort of helping start conversations about solving problems in different spaces in an academic setting, and then you moved on to Greenlight Fund. So, you had experience in those spaces. When did you know it was time to graduate to a new position, and how did this opportunity sort of present itself? Why did you choose to take it, and did you think this was going to help you make more impact in a different area?
Sure, I appreciate the question. I'm going to say two quick things before I jump in on my current role. One, I'll be remiss, because I know we started down that line, not to say that all of this sort of, a lot of the founders' mentality and starting new initiatives and helping grow new value, whether it's for-profit or nonprofit, it has to sit on the bed of government and policy. Right? Too often we do get caught up in here. We don't have that conversation, right? Business forms, whether they're nonprofit or for-profit, they're all, even using that language, some of my colleagues don't even like using the word nonprofit because has a negative, word in it, right? Is that it's based off of the systems that our government, which we are the government, right, by the people, have built. So I also think more folks are getting engaged with that to know and understand that, we essentially have this tri-sector system, and they all interplay with each other. But the strongest influence, and by definition, because everyone's a part of it, is the government, and that always has to be factored in. Whether whatever your views on it, these are the governing laws of how we live and how we've set up these things. We have to think about that. So that was first thing I wanted to add, maybe for another session on another day. The second thing, appreciate you recalling some of the things I did too. As founders and as professionals, the things we put out in the world are the things we've succeeded on, right? I've certainly done that as well. So I also wanted to be clear that for me, I tried for-profit businesses, right? I tried launching things out of school that were going to be in a for-profit space. I did other things like consulting as well, and that were in, kind of the for-profit sphere. So all of those also kind of shaped me and shaped, my learning, and also kind of what my limitations were. And also when I think about, we talked about the different stakeholders and the values they derive from something, that the things that resonated with me more is obviously where I've ended up in. Otherwise, maybe I would have kept on pursuing some of those ideas back then. So anyway, so those are all the things that helped, lead me to some of my current work right now, with the Greenlight Fund. we're part of a national network. I was fortunate to be asked to be, and help launch the Detroit work, and so starting our work here in the city is, and it's been based on a lot of the principles we've been talking about, which is, what Greenlight Fund's trying to do is invest in things that work. But before we even get to that point, what we're doing is listening to people in the city that are most affected by the challenges around us, and then trying to build and partner around our residents and the stakeholders who've been doing this work for a long time. So these are some of the values that were kind of embedded in Greenlight Fund, and that I was really attracted to, and thought, well, this is something that we should really do here in Detroit. So I think for me it was a natural next step. And again, like these are these different frames on founders. I know you guys are have this founders podcast, and it's, I've been real fortunate to have tried to start some for-profits, some nonprofits, some governmental programs, academic programs, and now this work here. And it has a lot of the same principles, right? You got to listen to people. Our key thing is making sure that that people are centralized in our process, that we flatten decision making, right? We're making social investment decisions, if you will. And so again, all these things that we've talked about and I've learned from other arenas is it's less important what I personally feel or think or want to do, right? My job, rather than being the expert and the one with the ideas and the funding and whatever the case may be, I'm actually, I'm a facilitator. I'm an investigator. I'm a connector. Those aren't necessarily always words you think of with an executive director or CEO or a founder, right? You have these images of someone who has all the power and all the knowledge and all the ideas, and it's really not like that. The hard work, and ironically, to our other conversation, you find a lot of these skills in government and in politics, right? We're not in that space, but again, we talked about borrowing things, right? How do you get a bunch of people to agree on something that materially affects their lives when all these people are coming from very different points of view? So that's what I'm doing in my day job at a nonprofit that has some elements of traditional for-profit methodology. So it's really interesting because, again, it comes back to those principles. Can we find a shared value amongst us, right? Whether that's folks in the city who, if they've unfortunately been experiencing poverty or homelessness, right? What are their shared interests with the folks who are willing and interested in funding programs? And what about those who are already doing work on the ground? And what about kind of some of the new entrants or the long term? So what I'm actually doing in my new job is, and you can see it's related to a lot of the other things, is connecting as many of these interests as possible with those most affected at the center. And that's the work we're trying to do. We know we can constantly improve in what we're doing, but a lot of my other experiences help shape this for our work right now.
I think after being a connector, because you were probably also doing a lot of connecting in the other roles that you were in, whether those were in the for-profit or the nonprofit. Oh, by the way, I just wanted to add a note. A professor of mine also did not like the term nonprofit, and she would, and Dominique knows who I'm talking about as well, but she would use the term for impact. And I mean, again, not that for-profit companies cannot be for impact also, but I do
Right.
like that terminology a lot better. But
Yeah.
going back to the point about being a connector, I guess for someone who's starting out, building new relationships for themselves and for other people so that they can come together and all solve problems, what would your biggest piece of advice be? Because I think there are probably some people listening who are stepping into leadership roles and have to be doing a lot of that.
Yeah, for sure. Well, the theme that you've heard is just listen to people. But you can say that like in my position where I have a lot of power relatively, around, my professional sphere, I can get into spaces and listen and sometimes be listened to. So what I also would say is you have to ask, right? You can't just listen. You have to ask. You have to be willing to not be the center of all the things, right? Usually entrepreneurs and founders end up being that, right? You have to have enough humility to know that for you to succeed, you have to be willing to ask questions and you have to listen, because the more you can learn from others, the more that builds your ability to do things, you know? So that's definitely a critical component to a successful path, I believe. Realizing that like progress is shared, right? Like we have this sort of, there's this phrase again, you know, words matter. Like we keep coming back to, right? This sort of, what's that phrase? This self-made, right? Self-made X, self-made Y, you know? So, you know, like we love that. Our culture loves the self-made because it's a story, right? It's Hollywood. Those are stories that, you know, are engaging. It's just, you know, but again, you know, no one's self-made, right? You had people when you were 2 years old that did stuff for you that allowed you to do things when you're 20. And we actually know the data, right? When you're healthy, you have good food, you're mentally XYZ, by 8 years old, like 80% of your brain it's set, right? There's so many things you can think about that society are part of us. So you have to like carry this humility about how you did the work and realize that everything we're doing is collective. The people that have helped you, that have teach you, and frankly, a lot of people that don't, you never know. You know, the people have created, again, and these are a lot of those policy, government, big systems folks, right? Have created the way we govern, our culture, our infrastructure. All of those things come into play. So yeah, I don't want to get too far out there, but.
You talked about measuring social impact and social change, and that's one of the things that I know Greenlight Fund does as well. Just checking out the website and reading more about measurement, but that's also a huge challenge in that impact space. So I wanted to know, can you help us understand a bit more on how Greenlight Fund communicates its impact, or essentially its value? And I just want to break that down just a bit though first.
Okay.
You shared the definition, a general definition of social entrepreneurship, but before you dive into how you share social impact value, can you kind of give a general definition of social impact value, and then how Greenlight Fund communicates that to its board and shareholders and community they're working with to impact?
Yes, great. So I think it's the same sort of derivative of what we talked about before. So when you talk about value, what we need to do is think about, okay, what is the social impact we are trying to deliver? Start there. Then we say, okay, well, by social impact, we mean it's a significant positive change for a pressing social challenge. So when you think about just those basic elements, the first thing you have to do is understand what the pressing social challenges that you're getting at. And I use the word pressing too, because there's social challenges everywhere. So pressing gives a little bit more urgency to it. It also requires you to be proximate, right, to the people who are identifying that challenge, right? The more proximate you are to the challenges you're hoping to overcome, the more authentic and the more true it will be. So again, like I have some challenges in my life, but I shouldn't be basing my community work on that. I need to get, again, proximate to people who can identify that and say, no, these are the things that we are facing together. So that's the first thing, is like identifying the need. You'll see a lot of entities, they do stuff and then some good things happen and then they kind of take credit for it later, right? Like, oh, we did this thing, and later there was, I don't want to like call anyone out on the podcast, but like, and then later some other nice things happen, whether it's because of them or not, and they said, this is what we did, and right, that's dangerous because it's not deliberate. That means you didn't go about trying to solve something deliberately and put your energy and resources to it. It just happened to be a nice thing. So this is why when you talk about value and metrics, from the beginning, you have to be very clear, what is What is the need? What is the, some might say either metrics or space? How do you want to know that you're going to get better in some way? And for that, you have to listen to the people you are attempting to serve with. That's the first thing. And then the second part is, and this is the continual debate, the hard part is how much, right? What is the significant positive change, right? How much of that value is valuable? And this is, again, a whole other, it's not just a podcast, it's our society debate for a long time. You have different factions, right? There's some that are very metrics oriented, right? I want to make a social impact. I've identified a need, and here's the change I seek, and it's usually numbers, right? And we can talk about outputs and outcomes and all, there's a lot of ways, there's a lot of theories in action about this. And that none of those are wrong. It's just that the idea of value is much more complex than a set of numbers. But as humans and with a limited vocabulary, a shared vocabulary, that's probably the starting point that allows people to ground themselves in this idea of progress, especially when you're talking to a lot of people. So, with Greenlight Fund, that is part of our point of view. We believe that needs to be, following metrics and seeing how they're changing over time is one of the indicators that we've made the social impact that we have promised to deliver, with our partners and with our investments. I think the problem is if you just rely on that, right, then you're just playing towards a set of numbers. And again, numbers can mean a lot of things. They can be very frivolous or vanity numbers, and they can be things that truly are showing, wait a second, lives have changed, or this is what people actually want at the end of the day. So at first there's the numbers piece. And again, within the numbers, there's different layers of that. But then the other part is more deliberately around, and this is going to, it sounds different to different folks, but how do people feel about their lives? How do you measure that, right? How do you measure satisfaction? How do you measure, peace and balance and not stress and health? Now, again, there's definitely ways we can do that, right? If your blood pressure is X number instead of Y number, we know that's something that's at risk and maybe we want to lower it. But you could still be stressed and not have your blood pressure be up. And so you might have normal, I don't know why I picked this example, but let's just run with it. You might have normal blood pressure for your whole life, but there are these other things that make you not feel good as a human. And in fact, could also lead to you, having really bad physical health consequences in the future. So I guess the point here is when you think about value, having some sort of metrics and being honest and authentic, are these metrics just to, top level, or are they deeper metrics, is one set. And the other set is talking to people, is sharing stories, is understanding how people's individual value and feelings are around those things. And the classic thing is, right, how much do you love your family members? You put a number on it. Is that number less last year? Is it 20% gain? Is it a 15% gain since the last holiday? How do you do it? So, and there's a lot in between, but those are just kind of general brushes. And this is the part that I know I'm going to get a lot of people wanting to dig deeper on, or, call me out on. But again, these are broad strokes. It takes a couple hours to really figure out what it is you're trying to accomplish, and not marginalizing it through just numbers or just maybe even just stories sometimes.
No, I think what you're saying, it definitely makes sense because there isn't a common framework to measuring social change. When delivering hygiene items to individuals, I've searched tons of research articles and there isn't research that can measure the psychological well-being of an individual. It's really difficult. So I think that was a great example of saying, how can you measure how much you love a family member? You can't put a dollar amount on that, or how much is enough, how much is too little. you won't be able to win on either side. So I like that you pointed out focusing more on stories to understand the impact, and listening to the community that you're working towards impact is huge. And especially including that community in the decision making. I believe I took a note here. I think you called it, you wanted to flatten the decision making process.
That's right.
Yeah,
That's right.
yeah. I thought that was really phenomenal. Just sharing that, because that's what it's about, as opposed to going in with a savior mentality and thinking that you know everything. Recently, we spoke to Sue Jane. She's one of the founders of Repella, and it's an eco-friendly product that they're creating to help out the environment on boating, the boating market. So she was mentioning, like, she honed in on customer discovery. That was essential, and listening to the customer. And because of that, they actually made different changes in their model when understanding who their customer is. So I think when measuring social impact, it's vital that you take a step back and not only listen, but be open and willing to make the changes needed to create a long-term sustainability within your company.
That's right. That's right. And I'm glad you brought that up example too, because again, when you're focusing on a certain metric, right? Let's say you want this outcome to change. You've had that number change. Let's say there's also potential, negative effects. I'll use a founder example, right? I've definitely launched things and run things where, the outcome was awesome, right? Everyone's like, this is exactly what we want. You reach the social impact, but I sacrificed my own health, right? I might've sacrificed other people's well-being. How do you factor that into that metric or number that you just created? If, there was a whole bunch of other negative, some people might call them externalities, or there's a lot of terms for it. That's just a small individual example. We can blow that up to societies and companies and industries, right? Especially when it comes to the planet, because the planet is the one constituency that, definitely doesn't have a voice for themselves. And there's plenty others that have very little, that are humans, of course. So it's pretty layered. And the thing is, not everyone, but so much of the industry and folks in the space, they want more of this now, because for us, it's easier to distill things down into numbers to be able to kind of compare as society and media and whatnot. Plus, the way we've built our system of value, in our current society has largely been driven by numbers and dollars, right? So again, that's kind of where we're coming from, because that's what we're just used to. Everything's built on that. So yeah, those are just some reflections. And again, it's the numbers aren't bad. They give you a point of reference. It allows you to see if you've made progress. And I guess I'll add one thing per that example you just gave too. The best numbers, or even more importantly, the best categories of numbers, I would say, are the ones that were determined by the people seeking the change. In other words, right, if you're working with a group of people and they're saying, I want to lower my blood pressure, that's the big challenge. Well, then you have a very deliberate, okay, there's a number here and you want to get here. Let's work together to lower that number, right? And, again, you still have to consider all the other stakeholders and all the values. Well, how much effort did that take? How much money did it take? How much time did it take? Did you sacrifice other things? You got that number down, but perhaps some other things now are negative in your life for whatever reason. So it's complex. There's a lot of layers in it, and we'll continue to try to figure it out and make it, folks want to make this a lot simpler because it's easier to package, sell, discuss, but in fact, it's always going to remain complex.
Ooh, that was good. Yeah, complex and layered, but most of all, I think you just made that very simple. Just look at the needs of the community that you're working towards impacting and set metrics based on that. Versus, I know we do a lot of Googling, we meet with our mentors, And from that, we get an assumption on, okay, cool, this is what my metrics should be and to work towards. Nope. Just focus on what the needs of the community are and set metrics towards that and getting there. Because if you continuously set your metrics based on this standard without including the community that you're working towards, it's almost like you'll be working towards a moving target, and you'll get frustrated and burnt out, and you'll look up and you'll say, wow, have I even made any progress? And you most likely you may not, because you're working towards targets that aren't aligned with the goals, missions, and needs of the community that you're working towards supporting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, totally agree. Well, I think one of the challenges remains like this idea of financial value as the driver. Again, we were talking about like these different types of value that we have. We're conditioned to think that dollars is the ultimate value, right? If you come out with more dollars than less, like things must be good. And so when we start with that set of assumptions, everything else gets a little bit distorted. Even though you might not feel that way, we all kind of have to chase a dollar in some way to survive and persist. So that gets into some more broader questions that maybe we don't need to go down here today. But yeah, no question. I appreciate this discourse for sure.
We talked about, measuring change and setting metrics based on listening to, the community or the customers that you're trying to cater to. That's also something we talked about in a previous podcast session also. So yeah, it's really, really important, and I'm glad we're reiterating that today. I also wanted to ask you, you talked about a few different ways to make sure that you're honing your leadership skills and you're making sure you're doing the listening and all of that. But I'm wondering if there are any specific examples where things didn't go quite right that really helped you grow, as a leader.
Yeah, no question. I think that's happened multiple times, to be honest. And it's come out in the themes a little bit of what we're talking about. Sometimes our own ambition or our own interest in status or opportunity or, feeling good for ourselves because that's what we think can, especially as a founder, that can get in the way, right? You can trip over the fact that you're serving others. It doesn't matter if you're a social entrepreneur or a for-profit business person. At the end of the day, you're trying to create value for someone else. That's what's going on here. And so I've definitely had those experiences where you're trying a little too hard to get the thing that you want to do done, and maybe it's not fitting, round peg, square hole, and all that sort of stuff, right? You might overextend yourself, in a certain way too. But at the end of the day, if you sort of start losing focus on the fact that you're serving others and others need to, their input, their interest, their power in the situation, has to be factored in. I've definitely had those experiences where, you're kind of chasing the solution that you've created. You've had all this sunk costs, you've spent all this time building this thing and it's the awesome mousetrap and some people really like it. And, you keep going with it. And again, in our story, in our lores, 1 out of 100 of those, you stick with it and it ends up being the greatest thing. But 99 out of 100 of those didn't work for probably good reasons, So we have to talk about those things. And I've had some too. And I think a lot of that has been, you fall in love with the solution when you should be falling in love with the problem that you're trying to solve. And more importantly, as I say now in my work, you should be falling in love with the people that are presenting with you a problem that you're then trying to solve. The closer I can get to there, I think the more success I've had, because then you're really, listening to others.
Yeah, I think that's great. I don't think people talk enough about that third step, which is going from like not focusing on the solution, really focusing on the problem. And I think we hear that a lot, but I don't think we hear enough about focusing on people and making sure that's your main goal. And I think
So
people forget to do that sometimes, especially when you're first starting out, and that can impact the whole thing that you're
that's
building.
right. Because now, kind of problem solving and do-goodery and social impact, that's its own status now, right? That's a big reason why, business is changing the way they're approaching, because consumers are saying, no, 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 we want to feel good. We want to know you're solving social problems too. That's been a lot of the push for kind of changing some of the traditional for-profit mindsets. And so you do have to push it even further sometimes, and not just be in love with I'm a problem solver, or I know the problems, or I'm embedded in a problematic area. That's one of the challenges with it, and getting back directly to people. And I'll also add the planet. Obviously, my focus has been mostly people and the types of work I've done directly, but the environment and social are intertwined, and we only have one place where we can live, and that can survive as well. And so the more we push and try to listen and learn from what the environment's telling us, what people are telling us, I think we'll all collectively be better. And to be clear, that doesn't mean we lose quote profits, or we lose these other things. There is a lot of false trade-off kind of mentality. Again, we talk about that spectrum, right? Heart and dollars. There's just this mentality you can't do both. You can't grow responsibly and make some money, right? You can't run a business and really create other sorts of value for people other than economic value. That's just ingrained in us because that's what we've been thinking for so long. That doesn't necessarily need to be true. We've seen it overcome in a lot of other arenas.
Since COVID, all of these corporations now are coming out with different roles like community impact manager, all these different things now. It's like they've woken up and realized that, oh, okay, maybe there should be an actual role designated to bridging this gap between corporate and community. And I found before within my experience that many times when companies or these larger corporations are helping out the community, it's like a project that's been placed on another employee, like something just extra to put on their plate versus them dedicating a serious amount of time to really understand what the needs are. Um, so in my opinion, it came off as though it was like a checkbox that they were doing, to meet their corporate social responsibility goals, and not something that was a part of their framework because they wanted to do it. So I wanted to know, since Greenlight Fund has already been working in this space, how has the COVID-19 pandemic impacted Greenlight Fund, if it has at all, and with working with these type of companies?
Yes, for sure. So a couple of things around the pandemic, and
Mhm.
a lot of, especially as it started, unfortunately, obviously through today as well, working in communities that have not had the resources and advantages that some others have, there was this pause that happened, right? There was this thought, and the action with the atmosphere where people realize across the board, well, there's some serious problems, in our communities, and the folks who've been either living those or fighting those for long, like a lot of this wasn't new, right? A lot of the challenges that COVID has brought on, right? This idea, like, wait, I can't go to work. Well, there's plenty of communities that had that same problem, different lever that was pulled. If they can't get to work and they can't work, that's going to hurt them. If they can't get, healthy food, if they can't get the products and services they want, they can't go to school. all of these things, suddenly everyone was like, wait a second, what's going to happen? Who's going to take care of the kids? Well, plenty of people have had that challenge before the pandemic came. All right. So there's so many things that have happened that aren't necessarily new to, unfortunately, so many people because of COVID. It definitely exacerbated things, especially when we talk about structural issues, structural racial issues, of course, and how we support different communities of color. So I think, when you start there and you realize, well, the pandemic didn't really bring a whole lot of new problems. It opened the eyes, I think, to a lot more people, and it exacerbated, sadly, some of the challenges that too many communities are already facing. Now we're in the stage where we can reckon with, okay, well, how do we respond to that? Do we want to go back to pre-COVID in certain measures or not? And again, if you go back to sort of that, the sort of stakeholder, mapping out the audiences of the people that are part of society or a business or not, right? What do consumers want? Are they going to change their behaviors, right? And we definitely have. On one hand, you have consumers, for example, saying, we want, as you brought up, we want our companies to be more responsible. So companies have responded, some really well, some maybe not. At the same time, that same consumer is sitting in their house and is like, I am going to just order things online that are going to be shipped to me, to my door, by a truck that came on a plane, wrapped in a package for the small thing that has now desecrated the environment by X percentage because, I don't necessarily feel like, even after COVID's gone, right? I'm used to everything coming to me directly. So you're holding these two sides of the equation, right? One hand, you're like, no, consumers are saying I want certain actors to be better. And in other arenas, they're actually maybe being, quote, worse. Again, depending on whatever that value metric is, planet or impact. So we're all both helping and hurting to some degree, what's going on here in the pandemic. Now, directly in terms of our work, we work, our job is working with so many different folks, again, across the city to combat issues around poverty. And so that means, I think the saddest part for me has been that I've been mostly have been on Zoom. And to what we talked before, not being proximate to our communities and our partners and the people doing this work really affects, everyone. And it's a hard part of to not be in front of people and not to be talking with people and not being in their spaces and in their communities. That's the only way I can do my work. So although we figured out hacks, for especially the professional class, it's not enough and to be able to be truly engaged with folks in this time. So that's been the hardest thing. No question. And we have to figure out better ways. But again, back to what I'm saying before, like that's not a new problem for a lot of people, this accessibility and being present and being proximate with people. We had that problem, in our sector and industry even before this happened. Now it's just even more we're more hyper aware. Wait, I'm just sitting in my living room, right, with a great background. Meanwhile, people are still, struggling with the things they have to struggle with. And I'm not necessarily in those spaces with them and learning it and trying to figure out how I can help. So that's been the biggest challenge. And, in some ways it's also, again, there's been challenge and there's some opportunities because the culture of how we need to meet and talk and connect is changing a little bit. One thing Greenlight does is we partner with other cities across the country. That's a big part of our model too, right? How do we open up a new channel to engage, meet, other folks and other cities and coalitions on problems they're solving? So that's a really unique part of, our process. So I can, and through, video conference and all of that, now that it's more universal, rather than flying around the country as much and doing that sort of thing, we can very more quickly get at, and the culture has shifted in a way to say, like, why don't we just talk, on video for 20, 30 minutes and understand each other? So that's cut down on maybe some of the excess that wasn't necessary before. That's made things more accessible. Before, when maybe only two executives would meet to talk about a thing, over a a meal at a place that is inaccessible to other people. Now you can bring, the whole team along and have people connect if they have the proper technology. So I've seen some things that have been, I feel, more equitable and have opened up some channels that didn't exist before. And then, of course, some of the usual problems that have gotten exacerbated and have created some distance for me as well.
I guess speaking of connecting with people and how that's changed and looking forward to new possibilities, I remember the three of us being at the networking dinner for Net Impact in Detroit, and that was obviously pre-pandemic in a very different space where we were all standing closely in like one house together and talking about the ideas and what new projects we were going to be working on in the future. So I guess with all of that community connecting going on and then everything that's changed over the course of the pandemic, what would you say is next for you and for Greenlight Fund in terms of the projects that you guys will be working on moving forward?
I do miss those events. I miss people. I think that's the hardest thing is being around people as we can. But again, I recognize my privilege to be able to keep doing my work more or less and not having to get out as much. It's a great privilege for so many of us. So I think there's a few things are going to change. I alluded to a couple things there, but generally go back to people and focus on people, because we've taken great care at engaging with folks, again, authentically. If you don't want to engage, or if you have a different thought of engagement, then I try to create those channels and those opportunities to do so. I don't always get it right, but at least I try to get there. So for example, we had in-person events and we kind of had the debate, should we still have an event? And, it was more focused on some of the programs we were doing. And again, with COVID, we shifted that. We now hosted, online series that the idea is to lift the voices of our partners. So we were able to use kind of our power and our positioning there to just do something different that at the end of the day, I think is perhaps even more beneficial, right? Because we're bringing more people along, more ideas into the space. You're hearing from people you might not have heard of from otherwise. So that's, one thing I think is positive in how we've responded. And, our core work on the ground relies on us listening to people and bringing people together. So again, because I think we have a lot of strong partnerships across the city and across our networks and programs, I'm not as worried about activating those as we have before. It's just going to be, how difficult will it be? What are the challenges that our community continues to face? Can we take advantage of this post-pandemic, the funding, right, the resources, this kind of once in a generation? And then someone on one of our calls, this isn't once in a generation, this is a once in a ever, right? The sort of the government, the federal dollars that are now being distributed to cities and states to say, let's rebuild some things. So we have a responsibility. We have to really look at that and figure out how can we responsibly and get some of these resources to the things that the community really needs. Again, when we talk about scale, we're living right now in the greatest scale. If you're an entrepreneur and you're saying, I want to scale some great solutions, nothing you do in the for-profit or the nonprofit sector will even ever come close to touching what is happening right now in government. Period. So if you're in love with the word scale and you haven't thought about what's going on in government or being involved in government, you're missing the boat. If indeed that is your number one thing. I'm not saying everyone is, right? But there's a lot of opportunity right now to build. Well, again, whether that's good or bad is like kind of beside the point. The point is it's there, just like the pandemic was there and we have these resources now. So we have to figure out what we're going to do with it and how, and do that well. So we're tuned into that too, and we want to be responsible and stewards and connect our people and our programs to that.
When we caught up the other day, we spoke about just how founders are constantly putting so much time, effort, energy into the lives of others. And many times it could be at the detriment to self. So when you talk about responsibility, have as a company or as an executive director to fulfill a commitment, we wanted to talk to you about the commitment to yourself and how that aligns with your purpose. So that being said, what is your failing forward story, and how has that aligned with your purpose and your personal commitment to yourself?
So I've had a couple, and early in my career, again, being so committed to a solution, and also, getting on a problem, but not quite, taking care of my own health, the people that I work with. I had those same situations. I probably shouldn't say this with my parents listening to the podcast, but right, living out of my car for a little bit, those sort of things. Like, for me, that was, my family would have thought, wait, what's going on here? But those are the things that, I did in pursuit of, building and creating, somewhat on my own. And so, there was those times like that, whether it's relationships, whether it's your health, whether it's your housing, where, again, I want to be clear. I have a lot of privilege in those. So those were choices I was making. Those weren't things that were forced upon me. And then you realize that these are things that are forced upon other folks, who are struggling, and you start really thinking, wait, why am I putting myself through so much because of this idea or this business or this initiative that is so important. So those are good checks. Those are good reality checks, and that's what, you need good people, you need good friends, you need a good family around you to keep you as a founder grounded and healthy and above water. Because the thing is, it's never just about you either, right? When you start going into sort of those behaviors, extremeness of trying to get something done, you affect those around you, whether that's your staff, right? Whether that's your community, your people. And again, we have to learn better from that. We have to stop putting so much pressure on ourselves. We have to stop chasing false urgency for a lot of things. When you're a founder, you think everything's important all the time. When you're executive, sometimes as well. And it's just not the case. The problems, the solutions, and the people, most of them will still be there tomorrow. So taking those steps is a continual, path. To be clear, I'm not great at it still, and need to continue to get better at that for myself, and think about those people around me as a founder too.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, and also for sharing that you're still doing your own learning and growing also, because I think almost everyone that we've spoken to for the podcast so far has said that, and it's very reassuring to hear that. I think for Dominique and I both, as we're starting out on our journeys, and people who've been doing it for a while, compared to us, are still sort of going through the same growing and learning process as we are. So that is reassuring to hear. Yeah, so thank you for telling us that story to sort of help close us out. We love hearing everyone's feeling forward stories. They always provide a lot of inspiration for our listeners. And it's actually how we started the entire concept of this podcast. So we like to go back to our roots at the end of every podcast.
Of course.
But yeah, where can our listeners find and connect with you and the Greenlight Fund online after this episode?
Yes, I appreciate you having me, and feel free to reach out. I think you have a couple of my channels, but on our website too, or on Twitter, feel free to reach out, or follow or message if there's things that we can be helpful with. Would love that, and love what you guys are doing. Love that you're continuing to support founders and creators. The more we evolve our minds from the boxes and the separate things and the separate labels, and realize, look, we're all trying to create value. We all have different definitions of what that means. Let's listen to each other. Let's help each other. Let's be as proximate as possible to the people we're serving, regardless. Those are all the takeaways. And these stories, this time we've spent together is so important. I appreciate what you guys have been doing and launching and we need more of that. So thank you. I'm honored to be part of your first year of this podcast.